Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
Okay, thank you very much, Mayor. So I'd like to move that based on the March 30th, 2022 staff report, official community plan OCP bylaw number 3070, first and second readings. Council give first and second readings to official community plan bylaw number 3070, 2022. The council has considered the proposed official community plan bylaw number 3070, 2022 in conjunction with the City of Courtenay 2022 to 2026 5-year financial plan and the Comox Strathcona 2012 solid waste management plan, and finds no significant conflicts. That council refer official community plan bylaw number 3070, 2022 to A, the Comox First Nation for comment, B, Provincial Agricultural Land Commission for comment, C, Comox Valley Regional District for the purpose of acceptance of the regional context statement by the CVRD board, and that council direct staff to schedule a public hearing for official community plan bylaw number 3070, 2022.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Councillor Cole-Hamilton, for reading off that lengthy motion. And Mr. Garbett.
Thank you. Through to council, our newest long-range planning manager, Nancy Goddard, is going to start with our an overview of the official community plan report. And I know that Mr. Norm Carruthers is here, and he'll also give an overview from the advisory committee's perspective following Nancy's presentation.
Hi there.
Hi, Nancy.
Hi, good to see my slides coming up. So through the mayor to all of council and all of those in attendance, it is an honor and a privilege to be presenting to you today Courtenay's new OCP for first and second reading, Bylaw 3070. This is a project, as you know, that's been 3 years in the making. Next slide. So I'll be presenting to you all a bit on how far we've come and what we've heard through that long process, and really the main part of my presentation on the key OCP changes made since the phase 5 consultation. My presentation is about 20 to 25 minutes, so I do believe this constitutes the main course, to stick to the analogy, and maybe if you want to have a snack yourselves, now's a great time to do that. Next slide. So the need for an OCP update, the timing occurred in the context of societal increased recognition of the climate crisis. Courtenay's OCP was 14 years old at that time. That council directed that it be updated, and in directing that update, you also directed that it include a climate change mitigation and adaptation at all stages of its development. A greenhouse gas reduction target of net zero by 2050 was adopted thereafter, in line with the International Panel on Climate Change targets to avoid runaway climate change. And you can see from these images here locally, there was quite a bit of youth organizing on this topic of climate action, and understandably so, as it is this generation and the ones after that are expected to experience the negative impacts of climate change so significantly. Around this time, the city also joined the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, which is a network of communities dedicated to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and ensuring sustainable energy security. This network provided for ideas exchange all across Canada. Next slide. Now, an OCP is about much more than greenhouse gases, but efficient land use that allows for plenty of walking, cycling, and transit to meet daily needs is considered to be one of the most strategic ways a municipality can decrease their GHGs while also achieving other goals, like affordable housing, public health, efficient municipal servicing, and protection of environmentally sensitive and agricultural lands. So this lens of climate action, so through this lens, we talked to the community about many topics ranging from growth management, housing, transportation, parks, nature, social infrastructure, community safety, food security, local economy, arts, culture, and heritage, reconciliation, and even more. The OCP covers a lot of topics, but we know great communities spend attention to those details. Next slide. What I want to emphasize is that this plan was created from the whole community with a variety of opportunities to participate in sharing their views. You can see a number of the engagement techniques that were undertaken to hear what Courtenay residents, businesses, and stakeholders had to say. We learned through the pandemic that virtual consultation can play a role, and the city is definitely learning from the OCP experience to inform future engagement practices, including those public hearings. We also learned that people really like the neighborhood workshops in which they could talk with their neighbors about their ideas for their neighborhoods. Those were very popular, very highly subscribed. There are a few key themes that emerged early in the process, and they were voiced every step of the way. And those are reconciliation is very important, social equity is very important, wide range of housing choices are needed, land use planning should promote compact growth, natural assets are widely cherished, transportation planning and urban form should focus on people, walking, cycling, and transit. People, places, gathering spaces, and sense of community are important. Tackling climate change involves many concurrent strategies and delivers many co-benefits. Integrated approaches are needed to be effective in community actions on these wide variety of topics. And there is a strong desire for ongoing community dialogue and stakeholder collaboration, which is very good to know because creating the plan is actually the easiest part. So it's the implementation. We're going to need all those people working with us. So we documented our work every step of the way, and one can access that information on the dedicated project webpage, which will remain post-adoption of the OCP. There are many background studies and community engagement summaries that provide a richness of detail to the policies that are presented in the plan itself. Next slide, please. So we can go again. Next slide. Thank you. Here's a chronological reminder of how far we've come and the milestones along the way. Of course, the pandemic affected the timeline and sequencing, particularly of public engagement events, but overall, we were able to conduct all the phases of the project that we intended to, from modeling to research and public and stakeholder engagement. Next click. And the City of Courtenay engaged specifically and separately with Comox First Nation at Council's direction, and those engagement milestones are shown with the orange stars there. So that's how we've come, that's how far we've come and what we've heard in a nutshell. Now I'll shift focus onto the most significant changes to the presented OCP Bylaw 3070 as compared to its version presented for public and stakeholder consultation earlier this year. The first is the use of the term traditional with respect to First Nation unceded territory. The term traditional implies the territory was in the past, yet the territories remain today. Therefore, the adjective traditional has been removed in the context of traditional unceded territory throughout the OCP, wherever First Nation territories are mentioned. And we thank the Comox First Nation planning consultant who made this distinction and provided this educational opportunity in the city's ongoing commitment to reconciliation. And she did point out this is a long learning curve, and you know, people will continue to say traditional, that's to be expected, but she's pointing out the trend is changing. Next slide. Other change is in how we talk about Courtenay's changing population and housing needs. A frequent question throughout the consultation was, what if we're growing faster than the OCP growth projections predict? And why doesn't the OCP include population forecasting that takes into account the 2021 census? Specifically, we have added more language in response to those questions to recognize that the 2020 population forecasting that was done based on 2016 census, in the absence of the 2021 census results, we did 2020 population forecasting. We had to, because we could not wait for those results to undertake our OCP. The forecasting done at that time anticipated 4,500 more people or 2,900 more dwellings by 2030. And the land use modeling exercise was then conducted with those assumptions in mind. In other words, we looked at locations within the city that could accommodate these numbers, and those are focused within the growth nodes and as infill across the city as described more fully in the plan. When the first series of the Census 2021 data came out during the consultation period earlier this year, it showed we're indeed growing faster than we thought, about 0.8% faster. This is not a problem in the way the plan was created though, and the text in this section is modified to recognize clearly that this plan was modeled for 4,500 more people, and therefore as we get closer to that population figure, the recommendation is to update the plan. This section has also been updated to explicitly identify the types of housing that were modeled for, which is 28% as single family, that's 800 units, 18% in townhomes, or about 500 units, 15% in semi-detached duplex, 450 units, 31% in apartments 1 to 4 stories, about 900 units, and 8% in taller apartments than 5 stories, about 250 units. And then also suites and secondary detached, about 200 units. The provincial government now requires that all local governments that they conduct and update housing needs reports every 5 years. The next one for Courtenay will be in 2025, and therefore we'll be able to keep an eye on the population estimates to know when to update the OCP. Next slide. Another change was making explicit in the Part B growth management section of the plan that avoiding growth within environmentally sensitive areas, including the floodplain hazard areas, was part of the modeling to identify the most suitable locations for growth. That policy was contained within the natural environment section of the plan, which follows the growth management section. Yet wider consultation revealed that the OCP was not clear enough on this approach of avoiding certain areas for growth. And so we've included that more upfront in the actual growth management policies. This is shown in a conceptual way in the urban framework concept map shown here, which shows the growth centers as red and yellow in relation to environmentally sensitive areas, including the floodplain as green and blue. Next slide. A number of land use map changes have also been made. The neighborhood center land use designation boundary for the Ryan Road and Anderton Road Growth Center has been removed from the land use plan. While we know that a neighborhood center is appropriate in this location, it is considered premature at this point to set land use designation boundaries which have legal implications. First, more analysis and consultation needs to occur, and the policy in the OCP is clear on working with the landowner to agree to a terms of reference for a local area plan that includes public consultation and council approval. So that's why the amended land use plan does not have that growth center being shown on it, even though we do want growth there in the future. Next slide. Another change is this small block of lands near Vanier School. It has been redesignated from multi-residential, which permits up to 6 stories of residential, to urban residential, which permits up to 4 stories and generally expected to be more ground-oriented. Significant reservations by the community were expressed during the consultation, such as a drastic density change from the western side of headquarters, which is floodplain and where no growth is permitted, and the east side, where formerly up to 6 stories was proposed. And staff certainly, upon evaluating that, agreed with them. Next slide. Another somewhat similar change is in the Lake Trail Neighborhood Center, where this location shown in red has been redesignated from neighborhood center, which permits up to 4 stories and a mix of neighborhood oriented commercial uses, to urban residential. The Arden Creek that flows through this area is home to the federally listed species at risk Morrison Creek lamprey, and lower density residential uses are considered more compatible with the stream and species protection than the mix of uses. Residential uses, for instance, generally contain large areas of landscaping and open space for outdoor use, which are more watershed sensitive land uses than in commercial areas. Next slide. Now, I'd like to point out a couple of areas where no changes proposed from the January version of the draft OCP, but which are topics of interest from members of the public or agencies. This area in South Courtenay is not discussed to any detail in the OCP, and this is despite this area having a local area plan adopted into the current OCP in 2009, in which this area was largely designated for lower density and master planned residential as well as industrial uses. The OCP Bylaw 3070 today is directed to focus growth for a number of reasons identified in the plan, to be consistent with the regional growth strategy, for instance, to reflect best land use practices as directed by the province, to lower municipal servicing costs, etc. The South Courtenay area was not identified as a suitable candidate for growth for this particular planning cycle, given those goals. So that is why it is not discussed to the degree that other more central areas in the city are discussed. Now, the area has a very interesting land use planning history in which the zoning today, beyond the Buckstone residential development, the subdivision there, is for mostly industrial uses and rural resource uses, such as garden nurseries, silviculture, animal hospitals, and agriculture. The land use plan in 2009 supported redesignating a number of the rural resource zones to residential zones. What OCP Bylaw 3070 before you supports is actually status quo of the existing zoning today and freezing the areas that were intended for residential development until the next planning cycle, at which point the lands called future growth, which are shown in the hatching, can be considered for residential uses again. So I mention this because you will see a number of comments from the public in the survey that identify some concerns with this area, that industrial is being newly designated there where it was not before. However, the reality is that this OCP more or less maintains more along the lines of a status quo situation as today. Next slide. Another area where no land use change is proposed from the January version of the draft OCP, but is of interest to the Ministry of Agricultural Foods and Fisheries and the Agricultural Land Commission, is the area known as Block 71, shown in the red. These senior government agencies have expressed concern that future growth, shown in hatching on the image on the right, is designated in an area where agricultural land reserve lands are shown, which is shown with the dots. And the city's OCP policies are also clear that ALR exclusions are not supported as a matter of principle. So this can seem a contradiction. It's important to understand the history of this area to understand why the future growth designation remains in the plan. In 2004, 71 of the 150 or so hectares were conditionally excluded from the ALR. The city has understood since that time that these lands could eventually be to an urban standard and has factored for some servicing infrastructure accordingly. The ALC clarified in their referral comments that there were time-sensitive conditions to the exclusion approval that were never initiated, and therefore the ALC considers the exclusion permissions to have lapsed. If the ALC wishes to review the then established exclusion permissions and extend them, the city would, for this singular instance, support future growth within the ALR lands. That is how the land use policy has been clarified to reflect this. Next slide. Moving on from the land use changes, I'll talk more about some policy changes. In the policy foundation section, we have added a section on understanding affordability, along with the existing ones, which were understanding quality of life and low carbon approach. Affordability was raised as a significant question and concern throughout the OCP consultation, with many people asking how affordability was considered in the context of this plan. To be clear, the OCP was developed from its conception with broad and long-range affordability considerations in mind, such as the cost of municipal services, housing, transportation, energy, externalities, and inaction. This, however, was not explicitly described in the explanatory information of the plan. This has now been added for certainty and clarity. The inclusion of this information does not change any policies in the plan, as they were developed, as I say, with a holistic consideration to affordability in mind. Next slide. There are a couple of substantive policy changes on the topic of buildings performance as relates to greenhouse gas emissions. In the January version of the draft OCP, the policy on adopting the BC Energy Step Code was worded as is shown in the first version. In the current version, it is worded as follows, and I'll read it out. Accelerate adoption of the BC Energy Step Code in the BC Building Code to always be one step ahead of the provincial minimum energy step code standards. Buildings that include a low carbon energy system that satisfies a greenhouse gas intensity limit of 3 kilograms per meter square per year for primary heating and hot water may be constructed to the minimum provincial step code requirement. This was a topic of considerable resistance in the local development community, who observed that setting standards too far ahead of the province could result in local skills shortages and ability to obtain technologies and materials that would achieve the higher building performances. The request was to show incremental leadership in step with the province in order to accommodate a smoother transition in the building industry. The policy has therefore been amended to both set a higher standard than the provincial standard, which is consistent with Courtney's building bylaw today. We are one step ahead of the provincial standard today, while also incentivizing building applicants to utilize low carbon energy systems, which the BC Energy Step Code does not actually currently permit the regulation of outright. Next slide. Another change on the topic of building performance is in the January version of the draft OCP, the policy on requiring low greenhouse gas emission buildings as a condition of rezoning was worded as shown in the first version. In the current version, it is worded as follows. Require that new buildings subject to or developed as a result of rezoning achieve low greenhouse gas emissions as a condition of rezoning, defined as achieving a greenhouse gas intensity limit, again, that number of 3 kilograms per meter squared per year for primary heat and hot water. Firstly, this policy exists because, as noted previously, the province does not permit that local governments regulate greenhouse gas performance in buildings outright, and therefore local governments who wish to do so, such as those who have declared a commitment to climate action, have to find incentives and discretionary powers, such as rezoning permissions, to achieve those goals. The change in the wording is relatively subtle, as the original policy language was misleading in suggesting that the performance metrics stated would necessarily achieve net zero. They could, but wouldn't necessarily do so with the targets listed, as the mechanical and thermal demand intensity units could still be met with carbon sources. Therefore, the language has been amended to identify that low carbon shall be achieved, and the unit of measurement has been changed to that kilogram per meter squared per year, in line with municipalities in BC and evolving understanding of measuring GHG performance in buildings. It's important to note that the research and policy development regarding building GHG emission performance standards is rapidly evolving in BC, given that the provincial government is anticipated to announce an opt-in carbon pollution standard for buildings in the coming months. This would provide steps of GHG intensity targets and a regulatory framework to regulate GHGs within buildings, similar to the BC Energy Step Code steps for energy efficiency performance. Consultation on anticipated provincial enabling legislation indicates that the city's proposed OCP policy would align well with the provincial carbon pollution standard framework. Next slide. Regarding the practical applications of a 3 kilogram per meter square per year intensity limit, it's important to note that the intensity limit applies to primary heating and hot water energy sources and not appliances or industrial processing applications. Therefore, to meet the target, a building's space heating would be electric, but natural gas cooking appliances could still be permitted. Commercial applications that use natural gas cooking appliances like restaurants, as well as commercial or industrial applications like glass blowing, would not be measured as part of the GHG intensity limit of the building's performance, and therefore they would also be permitted activities. This table is from this document shown here, which provides for quite detailed analysis of what different carbon pollution standards would have in a practical sense. The province has yet to officially release their carbon pollution standard, so we can't say this for certain, but tiered targets of between 1 and 6 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter square per year are expected to be the targets they will be adopting, or at least the range. And Courtney's policy would put us in the middle of that range. Next slide. A couple of policies on waste management have also been changed to provide more specificity after consulting with Comox Strathcona Waste Management Services, of which the city is a member. We've added one encouraging the adaptive reuse of buildings and building materials through permitting and planning processes to help reduce construction waste generation. The OCP also now recognizes in the buildings and landscape chapter that at the end of their life, buildings can generate a lot of waste if materials are not disassembled, repurposed, or otherwise diverted from the landfill wherever possible. The Regional Waste Management Service estimates that demolition waste accounts for 25% of the total landfill waste stream. Therefore, reducing the amount of construction and demolition waste is key to extending the life of the landfill and achieving GHG emission targets associated with waste management. This is a particular consideration for Courtney because redevelopment of existing properties will be an important part of accommodating Courtney's growth. Policies and specific regulatory tools may be further explored in the upcoming update to the Comox Strathcona Waste Management Plan, which is expected to start later next year or this year or next. Additionally, more specific language has been added on the city's support for a number of waste management policy tools that are listed here, such as education, neighborhood, building, and residential unit diversion facilities. And what I mean by that is even as simple as just making sure there's enough space below your sink for a compost bin, for instance. Materials bans from the landfill, supporting the extended producer responsibility approach, obtaining accurate data of waste streams for monitoring, education, and planning, and also demonstrating municipal leadership. And a lot of this will have to be done regionally and with regional partners, but this shows the city's policy goals when engaging with those partners. The final substantive change I'll draw your attention to is the addition of the Parks, Recreation, Cultural, and Seniors Facilities Amenity Monetary Contribution Policy, very long term. The existing 2005 OCP sets a target of negotiating a value in cash or amenity equivalent of the amounts shown in the green box on the right. Sorry, next slide. So there's that green box. Yeah, there we go. So I'll just say that again, the existing 2005 OCP sets a target of negotiating a value in cash or amenity equivalent of the amounts shown in the green box on the right. The January draft version of the OCP did not contain this negotiation target for this reserve fund, and instead quite narrowly focused on affordable housing as the key amenity to negotiate when council is considering a rezoning. However, it's clear from consultation that parks, recreation, cultural, and seniors facilities are critical to livability of the community. Further, recent rezoning projects have indicated market viability to contribute to both amenity reserve funds or their in-kind equivalent. Hence, staff feel this is a reasonable addition. And I realize I should have told you click, so just click now. So these are the figures that are in the current OCP before you for the affordable housing amenity reserve fund. So these would be target negotiation amounts per unit, and then on the top of that would be $1,000 per unit into the parks, recreation, cultural, seniors facility, and that is applied to net increase in density, which the policy is very clear on from the existing zoning, whatever that zoning may be. Now, next slide. This concludes my presentation of the staff report and significant changes of the OCP. There are a number of smaller changes, a little over 100 of such changes that are inventoried in the staff report in attachment 3, and they include a rationale for that change. So people who've been participating in the OCP process all along, or even since the last phase of consultation, may be particularly interested in seeing what has changed as shown in that document. Next slide. All right, now I must take a moment to acknowledge specific contributions to the development of the OCP. There have been so many who have contributed in so many incalculable ways. I apologize in advance if I'm forgetting anyone, and I'm sure I am. I'll start by acknowledging the consultants retained for various tasks in the OCP development: Dialogue Design, Sustainable Solutions Group, Macola Development Services, Liquor Geospatial Consulting, Colliers International, and GP Rollo and Associates. A special thank you to our former Director of Development Services, Ian Buck, for stewarding the OCP project until last fall. I name only the former contributing staff members specifically. I thank more generally all the staff from all the departments who continue to provide support to the OCP development. And we thank last, but by no means least, the OCP Advisory Committee, who applied to be on the committee back in 2019 and were appointed by council to walk with staff and consultants every step of the way of this project to ensure that a broad range of community views are being represented. The Advisory Committee Chair, Norm Carruthers, will present to you now the committee's report and recommendations on the OCP. And Norm, I say a special thank you to you and Betty Donaldson in providing that chairing leadership to this dynamic and very energetic group. So I present to you Norm Carruthers for the next component.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Nancy. I really appreciate that. And Norm, you're on.
Thank you. And it's nice that the public and council can see the professionalism of your staff in terms of doing these presentations on complex issues. We had the pleasure of receiving that through the process. So my compliments to Nancy and the people who worked with her to prepare this presentation. It is something that should go up on the website. So I'm old school, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to sit in front of you. I'm not nearly as nervous as I am if I'm trying to face a Zoom camera and cope with this. Back in 2019, you established an advisory committee to help you contribute to the OCP process through this variety of ways, reviewing and providing advice on whatever topic we could think of, participate in consultation activities, and provide guidance on the process, help identify and connect with key stakeholders, help inform the community about the OCP process and encourage participation. And I think both individually and collectively. You can tell when I get proud, I get choked up a little bit, but I am really proud of what the committee was able to achieve individually and collectively on all of those dimensions. The membership, if we could just go to the next slide. This was a longer process than we signed up for originally. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge Sheena, Derek, Betty, Tanis, Annalise, Lindsay, Gary, Tom, Dawn, Diane, Charlotte, and Aaron, and Mayor Wells for being there throughout the process. A few had to step away from the committee over the last few months because of changing personal circumstances, but every one of the people on that committee contributed extensively. So you chose well. Now, you have our short report in front of you, and you didn't need another 1,000 pages to read through.
Thank you.
But I did spend the weekend looking over the new version because the committee had basically the January version to work with, and everything that went up to the January stage. And First, we think that this is a very good OCP. Every one of us agrees on that, and we urge you to adopt it. Second, you've set very ambitious and, in our opinion, very appropriate and necessary goals for the city. And you will need a very aggressive and engaging, very aggressive implementation plan to achieve your goals. We urge you going forward that this remains a real priority of the city because it's just too important not to. Third, success in this plan is highly dependent on the engagement and participation of the community as a whole. And while the pandemic restricted the public participation that you'd hope for as you laid out in the engagement playbook so many months ago, it's now even more vital that in the implementation there be a very extensive public engagement process so they can contribute to achieving, understanding what envisioned here and achieving those goals, be it on the social, the environmental, or whatever dimensions being considered here. Fourth, we applaud the use of the triple bottom line, social, environmental, and fiscal considerations to all the report that comes through council. But we would ask you to consider also incorporating the costs of not taking action. People can get intimidated by the cost of a new policy facing them. But if we don't, and the committee agrees with this one, this isn't just a personal statement. If we don't achieve things like the environmental standards and targets that you set out, our costs as a society will be much greater. So that I think that those hidden or external costs need to be recognized in reports so that people just don't say, oh, I don't want to spend the dollar. You have to make sure they fully understand the implications of it. And finally, as another citizen engagement opportunity, we would encourage you to consider an ongoing OCP Implementation Advisory Committee to utilize some of the talents out in the community to help you take this out effectively into the community. So those are our primary recommendations. And I would just like to do a couple of thank yous myself. First off to you, City Council. All of the advisory committee members are passionate about this community, and you gave us a voice and a role in this vital process. So thank you for that. We do appreciate it. Second, we want to publicly now acknowledge Nancy's work. Nancy, your amazing comprehension of the issues, your competency and knowledge, but more importantly, your grace and enthusiasm, which never flagged, were vital to not only this process, but to the effectiveness of our committee. And we thank you for that. And this OCP development was not a one-person show. Nancy was the one that we dealt with primarily. But as typical in any complex municipal process, there had to be and were many staff that made this happen. We need to acknowledge not only the more visible ones, so like Tats through the majority of this process, and Chris more recently, but the many staff in all your departments behind the scenes that had to allow something like this to happen. The coordination and integration across your departments is really quite an awesome task to achieve. And I think that the city's done a very good job of that. So thank you. And finally, my appreciation to my committee members. As Mayor Wells noted, there was respect, compassion, enthusiasm, and skill that was demonstrated throughout, but it was the respect for each other and for the process that was most important. So It was a pleasure to be part of this, and thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Excellent. I think Will would normally say, or Councillor Cole Hamilton, we should applaud for all the great work. I don't want to call you out, Councillor Cole Hamilton, but definitely a huge gratitude. You know, a project that was supposed to be, I believe, less than a year and a half, and you know, with the assistance of COVID, certainly extended that to I think about 3 years. So that expectation of the members and not to single folks out, but I mean, there were some people who were more established, and there were people who were more on the younger end of life. And I think the youth members of this advisory committee, I'm always excited to see and hear what they have to give. But not only that, but again, their dedication where you know, they graduated, they went off to university, but they still zoomed in, they still participated, they were still part of the event. And I specifically remember meeting with the developer organization. We had somebody with a laptop, you know, a little screen there, and she was able to participate in those events. And so that really shows how important the members, I think this was to them. So it is very much appreciated. Now, I usually chat after people are done talking to see if anyone has any questions and stuff. So I'm looking around, and now we have Councillor Hilling. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. And thanks, Norm, to you and the committee for the tremendous work and dedication. And thanks for your presentation tonight. So I have two questions. First of all, I think that it's quite remarkable that the changes that have been incorporated into the report that Nancy has outlined for us tonight, and how many of those are in direct response to feedback from citizens and organizations in the community. It was quite remarkable for me to read through so much of the feedback from community members in the surveys and such, and in the official consultations, and see that reflected in the plan. I hope that our community recognizes that their voices were in fact heard. My questions for you, though, are that throughout the minutes of your committee's meetings, there were a number of references to the length of the plan and the challenge that presented, and a number of suggestions that there be some sort of a condensed summary version produced. I'm wondering, first of all, if you have any comments on that, because I don't see that reflected in the final report. The second thing I wanted to ask you is, when we met at the meeting with the development industry, I got the impression from you that you were somewhat ambivalent about an ongoing committee of citizens involved in implementation. And I'm wondering if you in fact changed your mind, or if you've succumbed to the majority view on the committee.
Let me deal with the first one. It's, I think, somewhat unfortunate that the province sets such a broad, massive mandate and expectation for an OCP that on the one hand, it's to be a long-term visioning document for the city and its citizens to rally behind. That needs to be tight and precise and focused and understandable by everyone. At the same time, the OCP is to be a critical development document for the municipality, the developers, and everyone else. And it has to go into the specificity of greenhouse gas measures down to 3 units per whatever, or the building heights or the building specifications and whatnot. And so while we, and as passionate citizens wanted to be on the committee, our primary focus was how do we envision this city of Courtenay into the future, and how do we achieve that. So our focus was primarily on the latter. But when we talked about whether or not the OCP could be shortened, we had to step back and look at what was possible within the provincial requirements. And so, no, we didn't make that as a specific recommendation. So that's why that doesn't appear. On your second question, yes, I did probably show some ambivalence for 2 or 3 or 4 reasons, and I hope I won't wander here. Number one, the city has built in a number of things in its processes, in that every report to council has to report on its impact in the OCP. You are getting annual updates of what the status is and what progress you're making. And so the primary job of council, I see it as council's primary responsibility to ensure that this is carried out, that the staff are actually doing what your policies say. So I would want to, as a individually, want to make sure that there was value added. There may be particular roles that you can utilize a committee for, like identifying and engaging stakeholder groups. But we have to be careful with what the mandate is. It just can't be these 5 goals that we had previously. And thirdly, and I'll stop with this one, I'm an ex-CAO of a city. And the more citizen committees that you have going, the more difficult it is to both properly support them, do your own work, and support council. And so to me, I would want, before I would say, yes, we should do it, personally, I would want to see a very clear set of terms of reference so that we can see that the citizens who volunteer can provide real value to the process. Now, if that can be done, I'd be highly supportive of it.
Well, thanks. I really appreciate that. And I also thoroughly agree with you. Thank you.
And Mr. Garvin. Oh.
Thank you, and I appreciate my colleague's statement. I would also highlight for council that you're all aware that the province is actually looking at mandating, expediting approvals that are consistent with the community plan. So again, I am a community planner by training and enjoy and appreciate the public input. The OCP itself has given us some considerable guidance, and I would agree we would need to understand the role of such a committee and how it would accelerate or support approvals, as opposed to being sort of a gateway and or sort of a forum to have input on the community plans implementation, which is primarily done through applications themselves. So I just I very much appreciate the approval. There's a lot of heavy lifting. I think there's over 50 implementation recommendations, and we'll have to unpack them as time moves forward. Ultimately, the OCP itself has some key priority items to move forward, and that some of them are on the agenda tonight as immediate and coincidental zoning amendments. But I guess we'll just leave it at that.
Excellent. All right. Well, you got support there. So there you go. Councillor Cole-Hamilton, I've already turned your mic on. Sorry.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Mayor. And thanks so much, Norm, for the report. And I just wanted to think about a couple of the recommendations that you made. And one of them was to highlight the costs of inaction. And I think that's tremendously important, because there are costs that obviously aren't visible or aren't fully visible yet. And it's possible that during the last year, as we all learned the words heat dome and rain bomb and atmospheric river, that sadly we got a taste of what the costs are going to look like. And I do recall 12 months ago when the heat dome was beginning, that we lost almost 600 lives in British Columbia in a period of about a month. And during that time period, it was 5 times as many as were lost due to COVID during that same time period. And you think of the lengths that we went to deal with that particular threat to our long-term stability. So I absolutely echo that. And I guess I also was really intrigued and I think very supportive of the idea of an implementation advisory committee. And saw the group strongly advise that. And I was just curious if there were any lessons learned from your experience, other than don't have a pandemic while you're trying to get work done, in terms of the composition of the group, in terms of the support that we were giving you as a city, if there were things that you would advise us perhaps considering doing differently, or if we were to implement an implementation advisory committee.
I think that it has to have a role, as I said before, but I'll expand on it, a role that's valued both by the community and by the members, and the roles are very clear. It can't be a gatekeeper that you get to say no to development or whatnot. That's another, you don't need quasi-bureaucratic group stepping in on the process that is really between the city, the developers, and council. Having said that, one of the areas that I think that we added most value was connecting to the community and using our knowledges, our linkages, our email lists to be able to identify key stakeholders and put the city in touch with them, and then help facilitate those meetings and attend those meetings. I think there can be a real role with that. A third role that we played in a more subtle way is that each of us had skills or capabilities or perspectives that were somewhat unique on the council, whether it was the youth, what they brought, the insights that they brought from their perspectives was really quite fascinating and eye-opening. To other members who were worried about the fairness and equity, reaching out and engaging and understanding the equity challenge groups in the community. And one of our members, and Nancy, facilitated a workshop with through the Comox Valley Art Gallery to do a walkabout with one of the projects that they were working on, and better understanding the issues of the homeless people. That was fascinating. So I think there are roles to play. I think they have to be well understood. One of the real challenges for this committee is that we were expected to meet about 5 times over the life of the project. Well, 5 times in the space of 18 months is reasonably fast turnaround. 5 times over the space of 30 plus months, with a huge amount of work that had to be done post-January, or even post-August, really. A lot of the work was done in August, and then there was a long writing period till January draft came out, and then another long rewriting period. There wasn't much value added that the committee as a committee could do. We could all read the drafts and comment on them and feedback, but as a committee, there wasn't much to work on. And so the spirit of core of the committee waned over that time period, so that I would think that if you're looking at this as a tool, a mechanism to help you with your processes, you would have to make sure that the timing and the amount of work to be done, there's a balance there. And this one stretched out too long for us to come away at the end of feeling that we've been as effective as we might have been.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that explanation. And I think it really helps articulate, those big questions about implementation and engagement and all those things. And of course, from council's perspective, a lot of the, I don't want to say authority, but a lot of the, really the development of this OCP was given over to that advisory committee. So it's sort of like I think there's an actually a justified trust there, you know, in terms of being able to get it done, and getting it done as quickly as possible under the circumstances. And again, I think you know, what we have before us right now is a pretty amazing OCP. Like, just it covers so many things in it, and it's really well done. And I don't think Nancy's going on vacation for another 6 months or year or two. I'm not sure when implementation ends, but I think that you know, yeah, all hands are on deck, and we have a great product to send out to the public. Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. And I take to heart the comments made about having an implementation plan and keeping our tab on the pulse of what the city is doing and how that relates back to the OCP. I guess I wanted to raise the distinction about some of the goals that are in the OCP and some of the sort of the targets and such, and the difference between that and having an implementation plan. And I guess the distinction I see is that the implementation is the action of those things. And so do we have someone saying, are we doing those? Are those happening? When I look at what we do as a city, I think about the efforts to make the place more livable, to make people feel like they have access to the services they need. You know, are they able to enjoy their life? And that's pretty human to think about versus numbers and budgets and all the rest. But my point, I guess, is that that's my job on council, is to watch these things get implemented. And so I guess the point is in the report, it's suggesting maybe there's a council or committee, but you're suggesting maybe that would have to be something different than what you guys were doing. Something different than what the OCP committee was doing. And maybe that's, you know, maybe it happens at the council level, maybe it happens at a staff level. Is that what you're thinking?
Well, ultimately, the delivery around the OCP goals is a council responsibility. And you need to know, and you will be learning through the regular reports and the annual updates that are in the implementation plan, where those stand. So if that's the primary route of identifying what progress is being made, then before you strike an implementation advisory committee, what role would you give them? And how would that differ from what you're doing? And augmented it, because it has to augment rather than detract. And so that's my only caution. Yes, implementation is action. But again, I'll switch to my old hat for a moment. One of the things that I was always surprised with when we had in my work, whether it's a volunteer organization or municipality, a set of agenda of what we wanted to achieve over the next year, 2, 3 years, the strategic plan. When we looked at how far we'd progressed, often it wasn't as a direct result of one of the actions listed in the report. It's the result of a spirit being adopted by the department, the community, the whatever, that moved this ahead, and you achieved your goal, but without necessarily taking on that project. So implementation evaluation is not just about which boxes have you ticked off of this list of activities that were identified. It is looking at what progress you're making toward the big goals on a broader dimension. Because if we could always identify what would happen in the future and we could plan for it with complete certainty, we wouldn't need a lot of this work. So implementation evaluation should always be done in the broader picture and not just a checklist of, are you doing these things that you promised back then? So that's the caution I would have. And you know, if there is a role for a citizen committee to help in that, then wonderful. That would be great, because we do have wonderful volunteers, knowledgeable people, committed people in this community that would love to help on something like that. It's giving them a role that they can value in, that they're making a good contribution, that it's not just frustrating bureaucracy, if you will, that there's real value added and that you feel it's value added. So those are, I think there's value there, but I haven't mapped it out yet in a way that I'm comfortable with.
I guess I would just concur that it's probably wise to keep a finger on those policies that we create. You know, is the policy to have more units? Is it to have more rental units? Is it to have a more diverse set of housing units? And then I think those are measurable things that we can see happen. And we can count the number of people in town, and we can look at how trips are made and all those other things. We can count the number of parks we have. And then there's always those reports from our citizens that say, you know, I enjoy these parks, or I go to these places and I use these facilities. And we sort of have those numbers to look at. But I guess what you're saying is the annual report could be the place where we track those changes of the large goals. So thanks for that.
Excellent. Yeah. And I think one of the things also is that articulation, you know, where we create the policy, staff are operationalizing that. And I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed, especially over the last year or so, is the meetings that we've had with staff to make sure what we're thinking, one, is it reasonable? How do we operationalize it? How do we make these things happen? So we have these strategic priorities, these strategic plans, but how do we actually operationalize it? Because we're not the ones actually going out and doing the work. And so I'm really pleased that, you know, the culture of City Hall and that alignment, I think that's there as well. And that two-way thing, so that when we're looking at the metrics that Councillor Frisch is talking about, you know, I think if I understood you correctly, you can have those metrics, but it's really about that, you know, teamwork, you know, makes the dream work or something. Yeah, with that, I don't see any other questions or comments. Do you have any final words? I'll throw it out to Nancy and Norm if you have any final things you want to, pearls of wisdom, etc.
I just have to smile and say that Nancy was brilliant. You had a huge OCP document that got absolutely no questioning. And a little 5-page report that we've spent some useful time talking about, and a citizen process of how we played a role in it. But you do have a big document there too. That so good luck on taking it through the public process and to third reading.
Thank you very much. And Nancy?
Well, it's not the last you'll hear from me on this project or the next item on the agenda. So I really can't say much more than I already have, which is just gratitude to have been assigned to this work. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Nancy. And with that, we do have a motion on the floor. All those in favor? Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Thanks. That was a great discussion. And moving on, Bylaw 3071, Councillor Hillian.
Thanks, Mayor. I'll move that council give first and second reading to zoning amendment bylaw number 3071, 2022, and direct staff to schedule a public hearing for bylaw 3071.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Any questions? Oh, Mr. Garbutt, hang on.
We have a staff report on these 4 implementation bylaws. Nancy, are you going to give an overview of each bylaw amendment?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
So those slides again, please. Thank you. So I am returning to discuss a couple of implementation policies that flow directly from the OCP and will be adopted in lockstep with the OCP, which is to say these will come into immediate effect upon adoption of the OCP. The public hearings will be held together of these 3 zoning bylaws as well as the OCP. A key policy intent of the OCP is to support more affordable housing choices across the entire city. Specifically, the intent is to permit a minimum of 2 units on any lot without having to rezone. So that second unit could be the form of a duplex, a suite, or a detached form like a carriage home or garden suite. Such policies allow for more efficient use of land, as well as allow for more flexible housing arrangements to be made on a property as one's lifestyle or life cycle changes, including with age. And it is now considered best practice to support people to age in place, given the independence and general higher health outcomes that result of being able to remain in one's home or neighborhood. For example, a suite may allow for a senior's family member to live close to them, or allow an additional income stream when on a fixed income. With Courtenay's population expected to experience the greatest increase in residents aged 75 years and older over the next couple of decades, these considerations are particularly relevant to Courtenay and the region. Secondary suites can also be suitable family-oriented rental housing, as they traditionally are larger units than an apartment style, can offer ground-oriented yard access for children. Permitting secondary suites is therefore considered a reasonable infill housing option, especially because it results in minimal changes to the character of existing neighborhoods. Throughout the 2.5 years of OCP consultation, infill housing across the entire city, including in existing neighborhoods, was discussed repeatedly with strong general support voiced by those who participated in consultation. A couple of aspects of the existing definition of secondary suite are proposed to be amended with this bylaw. Today, a secondary suite is required to form an integral part of the single residential dwelling, be a maximum of 40% of the total floor area of the building, and a maximum of 90 meters squared in size. Our zoning bylaw also, for certain zones, stipulates that it have a maximum of 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, 1 living room, and a kitchen. The amended definition would still require that a secondary suite form an integral part of the single residential dwelling. So what we're talking about when we're talking about secondary suites is truly a suite as part of the principal building. We are not referring to carriage homes or garden suites on this bylaw amendment. And the other requirement would be that it retain the maximum of a 40% of the total floor area of the building in order to serve as the secondary residential use. However, the maximum unit size of 90 meters squared is proposed to be removed, as is the limitation on how the unit is configured with relation to number of bedrooms, etc. So the zoning bylaw amendment also states that no parking requirements would be required. So no off-street or on-site parking requirements would be required for the additional suite, except if the property is along a cul-de-sac, just because those lot frontages can be so narrow and on a cul-de-sac, you know, that pie wedge kind of shape, and therefore then on-street parking is in some cases not possible at all. Also, I will point out that suites are not permitted in duplexes, and they're not permitted in townhomes, and it says at this time in italics because the BC Building Code changed a number of years ago to permit suites in both those forms there, and we will be looking at that in the zoning, the comprehensive zoning bylaw update that is scheduled to start later this year and then into next year. So, you know, again, back to that big policy intent, we're looking to find a maximum creative options for people to have more units. And then the other thing is that suites are not permitted in mobile homes, nor in the or for residential properties within the floodplain. Just a brief map. I know you have a number of, oh, next slide, please. I know you have a number of maps in your own staff report there, but I'll just draw your attention to maybe a simpler one. Is here you see where suites are permitted in the zones today, as shown in the orange. And the green zones, I won't list them all. It's well over a dozen, but the green zones are the zones that are being proposed to permit the suites. And you basically, you know, if this gets passed, it would double the amount of land base where suites could be permitted throughout the city. primarily in those urban residential areas. Next slide. So I've been talking about zoning bylaw 3071. There's also zoning bylaw amendment 3074, which is around parking standards. And a key policy intent of the OCP is to support sustainable modes of transportation across the city, and specifically to incentivize active travel, decrease the amount of land dedicated to vehicular parking, and decrease impervious surfaces of watersheds. Now, the Amendment 3074 proposes that cycling parking standards be added for multi-residential uses and categorizes them as Class 1 and Class 2, where Class 1 is more for visitor short-term use, not private secured, and then Class 2.
Nancy,
Yeah.
Nancy, I'm just wondering, we have the previous bylaw on the floor on the table right now. Can we just vote on that one and then move on to 3074, or were you planning to go through all of them and then have us vote on them?
I was planning to go through all of them, but procedurally I can do whatever is preferred.
Yeah, I think we'll vote on it, and then I think it'll be clearer for me. And then if there's any questions or whatever, we can keep each one kind of compartmentalized. Sorry for interrupting you there, but so on bylaw 3071, which was for secondary suites, were there any questions or comments? Yep. Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, thanks. It's just about the suites in an existing house, and just the procedure that would happen at the city. I know a lot of people might be thinking, oh, well, I have a bedroom in my basement or whatnot. And presumably they would go down to the city and express interest in having a suite in their home and see if they'd want to know how they would do that. And I guess there'd be an application process, which you can clarify. But I wonder if there'd also be something else that they would get that would say, you know, these are the things that you have to think about. I know there's a lot of fire egress, you know, the windows, yeah, safety issues. Is there the proper height in the unit? I mean, these are just the things on the ground that somebody might have to think about when they're talking about construction in their home. So, you know, and is that something we can have ready in the planning department to hand out to people? It may not be an exhaustive list, but maybe it's the most common things, the problems that people run into.
And Mr. Garbett wants.
Thank you. Through the mayor to Councillor Frisch. Many municipalities have gone through this process. They've established checklists and key building permitting requirements, and we will need to develop those and bring them forward. We aren't going to be reinventing the wheel, though. On that, there's lots of material out there, but it is a critical component to facilitate the process to enable these suites to be created. But I will advise council, though, that life safety minimum requirements for the building code are often very challenging to do inside of existing buildings. People will be frustrated, they will point to issues, etc. These are life safety issues in the building code. These are very important matters. That's why when you see, once we adopt this, you'll see how many people either pre-plumb or pre-do secondary suites inside new buildings. It's the easiest time to do that. I just want to prepare council for that, because someone will come forward and say, oh, this is just very, very, very difficult. These are the standards in the building code are there for a reason, and principally it's life safety. And so we'll do our best to work through with that, but there aren't variances to the building code.
Yeah, and that's why I bring it up, because I've seen these situations where someone gets excited about it and then finds out that their roof is 6 inches too low, you know. And that's a safety issue to some degree. It's a safety issue when you're a certain height, I guess. Maybe that's the deal. But the idea of having a window big enough to crawl out of, it's non-negotiable, and some people don't know that. So if we're upfront about those things, it can save a little bit of hassle. So that's why I'm getting into the weeds about it. So thanks for that answer. And sorry if we cut you out of the answer there, Nancy. Thanks.
Maybe you want to pin Nancy back up there in case she has any more comments or questions. But did you have anything to add to that, Nancy? Or
no.
We're all good. Perfect. Okay. And I don't see any other. Oh, hang on. I do see one. Councillor Hillian.
Thanks, Mayor. I just want to clarify that we're going to public hearing on this. That's what the motion is. Presumably we hear from the community. And that might be the time when we get into a more fulsome discussion of this. But just for clarification purposes, I believe most communities in the province are moving towards this approach. And I also believe that there are some parts of our community that actually wouldn't apply to, notably Crown Isle, which has its own
Building scheme.
that governs it. So if we could just get clarification on those 2 points, please.
Is that for me to answer? We consulted with Crown Isle before the report being published and the mapping made, and they indicated support for suites. The matter of enforcing building schemes, et cetera, I have to admit I'm less technically maybe versed in that, but the proposal before you is that all the comprehensive development 1 zones, which are the Crown Isle zones back from the early 90s, that they would be permitted to wherever those single residential uses are in, they would be permitted from the zoning bylaws perspective to have the suites. And we were, very encouraged to hear that there was a Crown Isle interest in that flexibility in their zone being built in. I don't know if there's more to add about bylaw or building scheme enforcement that maybe another staff member would want to weigh in on.
Yeah, no problem. I also just wanted to note that in the surveys that you provided us with as part of the reports, I believe the support for this concept was up in the 70+% range, as it was for most of the concepts that we're putting forward in this OCP. So I'm not sure how representative those surveys are of the population at large, but I think it's quite significant that that's the numbers of people who do support this proposal going forward. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Councillor Hillian and Councillor Moore.
Thanks, Mayor. I think I know the answer to this, but any suites that are existing now that are not in the permitted areas, they would just now be legal, I guess. And I guess it kind of makes me think that, we don't generally get, we've had a couple examples where there's a whole whack of problems happening in a legal suite situation that becomes a neighborhood problem, and then we hear about it. But in general, to my knowledge, we don't get complaints about suites that exist currently in areas where they're not allowed to be. So that makes me think that really it's not a huge issue, but just clarification on that. At this point, anyone who has a suite that they're not supposed to have right now will automatically become permissible, and there won't be any issue unless there's some kind of safety issue that a neighbor complains about or something, correct?
I'm Mr. Garbage. I would like to answer.
Thank you through the mayor to Councilor Moore. You're correct. So the land use would permit that. That it doesn't speak to if it had a building permit previously. And those issues arise and they will come and be developed. That'll be part of the implementation side of that, because at a point, the question may be asked around the building permitting, and many jurisdictions have brought this through. They've developed minimum requirements that are typically just life safety. Again, I would speak to the challenges a little bit in existing buildings. So the intent is very clear in this OCP to make this happen, and the building department will develop an approach to accommodate and look at permitting inside existing dwellings.
Excellent. Thanks for the questions. And I think that's it. So we have the motion on the floor for bylaw 3071. All those in favor? Any opposed? And Nancy, we'll get back to our regularly scheduled program. I do apologize because I'm not sure how far you were through 3074, but I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, no problem. These slides are much shorter than the OCP presentation. So I think the slides coming up online as I speak, but I'll maybe just remind some of those key things was policy intent to support, incentivize active travel, decrease amount of land dedicated vehicular parking. That actually was a connected discussion point, one of your variances you were talking about earlier, and a decrease impervious surfaces in the watershed. So the specifically what's being talked about here is that cycling standards, parking standards be added to the multi-residential use only at this time, and that there be a distinction and a requirement for class 1 versus class 2 facilities. Class 1 being more your kind of like visitor facility, and class 2 being more your long-term secure parking for that resident. Maybe that's the form of a bike locker or some sort of cage or accessory building for that, but secured. The design standards, we looked at Comox's. Comox has looked at Vancouver's, and so we liked a lot of the attention to details they had in there about just describing, as mundane details as making sure your lock can the shape of the rack can allow for your frame to lock properly to that, to just be extra secure, because we know there's a lot of poorly designed bike racks out there, and we want to make sure that these are functional. And other things like visual and surveillance and lighting, particularly in those bike rooms. And then also, so what Courtney's bylaw proposes, which which Comox's does not currently, although they know they need to look at it, they tell me, is the electrification of the infrastructure, the parking stalls and parking requirements for oversized bikes, because we know market share of those are greatly increasing. Next slide. And so the zoning bylaw amendment 3074 would propose that for class 2, the personal secure storage type of facility, that all spaces are required to be electrified and 10% must be designed for oversized bikes, and that 2 be provided per dwelling unit. And then for the class 1, the visitor temporary type, the bylaw states that 20% have to be electrified and 10% be for oversized bikes, and that 10% of the total required amount for the residential unit count be for visitor. And that's a very similar kind of formula that the vehicular parking standards follow, that 10% piece. This electrified and oversized bikes, there's a lot of communities looking at developing this right now, and we looked at Colwood in particular had been developing and doing consultation on this very, very recently, and so some of those those specifications around percentages of electrification oversize come from their research there. And at the same time, the same bylaw proposes reducing the minimum required number of vehicle parking stalls from 1.5 per dwelling unit to 1.2 dwelling unit. It's relatively minor change. We see a lot of the new multi-residential dwellings coming in at the city proposing some relaxation in vehicular parking standards. And then it also allows for some more of that space that otherwise would have been provided for a vehicle to be permitted, provided for these bike requirements that we're phasing in. Now, I must emphasize that these proposed bylaw changes, both 71 that you just voted on, as a form of infill development, and 3074, the bike parking, are the first in a series of changes on these topics that will be examined in more detail with the wider community during the comprehensive update of the zoning bylaw that, again, will follow adoption of the OCP, expected to occur primarily next year. So these bylaw amendments are included now, given the general public support that was voiced during the consultation and the fact that they are relatively easy to do. So to be clear, the OCP supports secondary dwelling units across the urban residential land base. So more opportunities for those carriage homes, those garden suites, those duplexes as a permitted use without having to get a rezoning will be explored at that time. And then and any changes I'll point out too is that any changes proposed in these bylaws today can even be examined for fine tuning when we do the comprehensive zoning bylaw update at that time. So this is my last slide on this bylaw. So I'll leave it to you to solicit for readings.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Nancy. And I think this really speaks to that, the questions earlier on about operationalizing the items that are in our OCP. So really appreciate this. Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to clarify, get clarification on the number of parking spaces needed You're suggesting we haven't really decided what's going to happen on secondary suites like carriage houses or granny flats in way of how many vehicle parking spaces we would need? Because we
I
haven't tackled that yet.
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I must have misspoken how I was describing that there. It was the piece, what I was saying was that we will talk about other forms of infill housing permissions and zoning amendments at a different time. And parking will be part of that. Generally, a property, especially traditionally kind of sized, is often large enough to contain parking for more than just the single residential home. So that is why the recommendation there is not to have the vehicular parking for the secondary suite. We could find, as we continue to support smaller lot sizes, et cetera, that it could be harder to just assume that there's, that extra parking on site. And however, we also know the plan is specifically oriented towards encouraging people to use all those other modes beyond a vehicular. So the ideal scenario is that people don't need as many cars in a household as they could be using today. So I realize I'm kind of giving a lot of context there, but on the matter of suites and how much parking will be required, we would examine that closer at that time.
Yeah, and I guess I was also, just noting that like 1.5 parking spaces, does that get rounded in cases? Like, does it get rounded up to 2 spaces for cars? And because that can make a difference for finding parking for suites. And I know we're talking about suites right now when we're looking at a bicycle parking bylaw, but if we're moving it from 1.5 down to 1.2, is there an argument to move it right down to 1? But that only applies if we're trying to round 1.2 up to 2 spaces, right? I don't know if that happens or not.
The parking ratios described here are just for multi-residential buildings, which would be those 3 units or more. So does that clarify?
Yeah, so for 3 units, you'd bring it down to 3.6 parking spaces.
Yeah, and it's been a long time since I worked on a zoning bylaw to see where the rounding happens, but I understand it's that rounding approach.
Yeah, and I guess that just brings up the argument, like, would you lower the number of car spaces to 1 instead of
oh, I see.
Instead of just down to 1.2, which was what I was going at for there.
Okay, yes, as I wrote a little bit more in the staff report is clarifying that the OCP definitely provides very clear policy direction that we want to lower vehicular parking standards for across the board, nearly all uses. The downtown already does not require parking for a lot of uses. So we do have to recognize there are places that in our community that already don't require on-site parking, but in general, moving towards even lower ratios will be what will be explored in the comprehensive zoning bylaw update. So right now, the reason these numbers are what they are is we were seeing those traffic studies, parking studies from multi-residential projects suggesting, hey, 1.2 seems to be a number that seems feasible, but and it's I guess you could say it's kind of a transitionary approach in our parking standards until we have the ability to examine them more fulsomely and enact the fuller OCP policy.
Yeah, that's fair. And I guess where that leads us to a variance, not inevitably, but possibly if someone can't find enough parking spaces to do the 1.2, but they can do something less, it just comes back to council in that form. That's what we see happen now. And that, I guess that would leave it less open to interpret our own policy from the OCP at that point.
We did want to build in some opportunity to avoid the variances having to go to council, which actually now there's new legislative framework where certain variances can be simply delegated to senior staff. But also you can build in the zoning bylaw the actual how you access a variance. So for instance, and certain communities do that. So they say very clearly that if you can't meet, let's say we stick to 1.2 per dwelling unit, if someone cannot meet that standard or does not wish to, and they can perhaps provide more bike parking, or they can provide a car share, or something like that. It's still transportation oriented, but that shifts the needle on the sustainable modes. then you can build the variance right in, so you don't have to create a lot of process around it. So we are aware that those are tools we want to be exploring. We want to have as maximum flexibility for people to enact our policies.
Okay, well, thank you for that.
Thanks, Councillor Frisch. I don't see any further, having said that, Councillor Hillian.
Thanks, Mayor. I'll move the council give first and second reading to zoning amendment bylaw number 3074, 2022 and direct staff to schedule a public hearing for bylaw 3074.
Excellent. It's been moved in second. We have had some questions and comments. Are there any further questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? Any opposed? That passes, and we're on to bylaw 3075. And we can move that now if somebody wants to move it, and then Councillor Frisch.
I'll move that council give first and second readings to zoning amendment bylaw number 3075, 2022 and direct staff to schedule a public hearing for bylaw 3075.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Back to you, Nancy.
So I have just one slide, and it's mainly an aesthetic one, so I don't even know how useful it is, but if someone's so kind to bring it up. So the final zoning amendment bylaw 3075 simply includes the development permit area guidelines and the temporary use permits to be included in the zoning bylaw rather than the OCP, which is where they are contained in the 2005 OCP. Now, zoning bylaws allow for more bylaw enforcement options such as ticketing, which will assist with compliance in instances where the zoning bylaw is not being followed. Additionally, a zoning bylaw is a more operational development application tool that outlines land use requirements, whereas the OCP is a policy instrument that is meant to direct requirements and regulations. Because development permit areas and temporary use permits are more operational regulatory tools, we believe it will be more logical for a development applicant to access these detailed oriented regulatory requirements in one place, the zoning bylaw, rather than consulting both the OCP and the zoning bylaw for projects that do require development permits. And just for those who don't know, maybe in our listening audience, the development permits are used to inform form and character requirements or protect for farming, environmentally sensitive areas, or from hazardous conditions, or for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and water and energy conservation. And those are the powers the province has given us with this respect. And they provide detailed guidance and city expectations on how to do so. That's exactly what that temporary that development permit area tool is. And then temporary use permits are a form of temporary zoning that expires after a certain date. So also very, it's basically zoning. So let's put it in the zoning bylaw, temporary zoning. So that's all I have to say on that bylaw.
Fantastic. And are there any questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? Any opposed? And that passes. Thanks very much, Nancy. That's been a very exciting night. I know it's a major milestone. So just again, want to give great kudos to the staff that have obviously worked their butts off. Sorry for the language, but and the advisory committee and our community that's really stepped up to get us to this point, and really looking forward to these public hearings. Thanks again.